Hi, my name is Tiffany Pereira. I'm an assistant research scientist with the Desert Research Institute. And with that, more specifically, I am a field researcher and a scientific illustrator.
Okay, so what is your current level of education?
Yes, so I completed my bachelor's at the University of Southern California. So I got a degree in environmental science and a minor in fine arts. And then I just completed my master's at UNLV this past spring.
So, how long have you been working in this field?
Wow, it actually, the next month will be 9 years that I've been working in the biological field.
What is the difference between just taking a picture and drawing a specimen out? What's the distinction there?
Good question. So, scientific illustration is one of the oldest forms of science communication. Today we see the hashtag SciComm, short for scientific communication. But if you go back centuries, the first scientists, like Charles Darwin, John James Audubon, they didn't have computers. They didn't even have cameras up to a point where they could take pictures or document on a computer what they were seeing. They relied on illustrators to not only document their findings, but to preserve those findings for fellow researchers in their field who then would take those data and build upon it. In fact, some of those early scientists were artists themselves. Charles Darwin was an artist, John James Audubon. Most of the illustrations in those bird guides were the paintings that he did himself centuries ago. And so it's an old art form that is still utilized today, especially by botanists. With photography, it's hard to get the same depth of field. Now with more advanced technology, we have scientific illustration techniques with stacking, where you'll get a focused image that's focused all the way through. But illustrations can convey the texture just so much easier with a black and white line drawing. And that's why botanists will still reference those old line drawings, and you'll see those as opposed to pictures in floras where you're keying out plant species. So there's room for both. Even in medical books, you'll see diagrams that are hand-drawn. And nowadays, artists are turning to digital tools. So it's still the same process. Even if you're drawing on an iPad, it's still a rendered illustration. You're just advancing with the advances in technology. So first, I'll take pictures. I've also have the permits. Not everyone can just go out and take a plant, especially if they're protected. So I obtain permits to collect what's called a voucher specimen. Bring back the voucher specimen that's been pressed. I press it and dry it out. And I'll use that as my reference along with the pictures to compose the composition. So I'll take multiple images of multiple different plants, and what you're doing is creating the most idealistic representation of the species. So I'm not picking one plant and just drawing it verbatim. I'm looking at the different plants, and it's actually drawn to scales. So there'll be a scale bar, so the image that I produce, if you put the scale to it, that would be true to life.
What is a typical day? What does that look like?
Yeah, so as a field biologist / scientific illustrator, we have two kind of days. The first would be the field day, and those are my most fun and entertaining days, the days I have to prep for very carefully. So we're out in the field, out in the desert, or out in the mountains. We're making observations, collecting data, depending on the project, looking at plants, looking for animals. And then we come home, we're dirty, we're sweaty, we're gross, but it's a good long day. You have to be prepared, you have to make sure you have enough water, enough snacks, food, and sometimes it could be upwards of 115 degrees out there, so gotta make sure yourself and your coworkers are safe. But that's the field day. But we also have the office day. And the office day is just as important as the field day because that's where we are synthesizing these data that we've collected in the field. We're writing the reports. In my case as Scientific Illustrator, we are doing our illustrations, drawings. So I do these detailed line drawings for plant specimens to help with identification. I've also helped my archaeologist coworkers by doing line drawings of the artifacts that they've found. So that could be an office day for me. It's either writing reports, synthesizing data, doing analyses, or doing scientific illustration.
What would you say is the best part of your profession?
I think definitely getting to interact with living things out in the field. So be it the plant species you can see around me or the wildlife species, as you can also see behind me. So bighorn sheep, desert tortoises I've worked a lot with, but also then getting to do the scientific communication aspect of it. So being able to take sometimes these complicated scientific topics, but being able to explain them or use my artistic abilities and my love for drawing, which is something that I never thought I could combine. Everyone talks about science and art being two separate things, like, oh, if you're a scientist, you can't be an artist, or if you're like good at math, you can't be creative. And that's just not the case. So I love being able to, those projects where I could bind the two together and use that as an educational tool to teach others, specifically children.
What would you say is the most challenging part of your profession?
There are definitely your tough field days where you go out and something you forgot your notebook, you forgot something way back 2 hours ago in the office. Days when it's just really hot and windy and you're getting sandblasted in your face. And then there's also the issue of funding. You know, money for these projects has to come from somewhere. So as scientists, we are seeking funding for these projects so that we can keep them going and keep that important research going. But sometimes that you win some, you lose some. You don't always get everything that you apply for. So it's definitely a challenge navigating those wins and loses.
So are there any recent developments or discoveries in your field that have been helping to fuel your work?
Yeah, so at my project at Tule Springs Fossil Beds National Monument, so that's on the north end of Vegas. It's quite a huge monument, and it's a fairly new monument, only designated in the last 5 years. So they're still working on building up their inventories of the plants and animals that are out there. They don't really know. And recently, one of the species that's found at the park, the Las Vegas bear poppy, has been petitioned to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to be listed under the Endangered Species Act. And that would be a huge development, not only for the species, but for the monument and for Clark County, where this plant species is only found. It's not found anywhere else in the world.
How would you describe how your profession gives back to our community?
Yes, so I make it a point, again, using those illustrations, using the diagrams that I create to try and educate the public, give talks, just make these videos to basically describe what we're seeing out there. People love to go on hikes, and oftentimes they're looking at the desert and they're like, oh my gosh, it's a lot of brown, and it's a lot of sand, and it's hot. And I encourage people to take a closer look when they're out in the field, look at the critters that they're seeing, look at the different plant species. It's all not the same thing. And so I could use these data that I'm collecting to basically help people learn more about the environment that they live in and call home. And they might not get to the same level of understanding, but it's fun to start to learn the names of the things that cohabitate with you out in your home. A note for anyone who's aspiring to get into the scientific field, you don't have to let go of that creative side. You can find ways to embrace both, and especially when it comes to SciComm, scientific communication, that's where that creative side can come in. It's being able to take these complicated issues and matters and put it in a format that can be easily shared and widely available for people to learn from. So don't be afraid to try and blend both together or feel like you have to give up on one to embrace the other. So get creative with your science. It is possible.